welcome to another edition of Sustaining Sustainability. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya, Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Business at the University of Pittsburgh. This week, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined from Boston, Massachusetts, by Mindy Lubber, CEO and President of Ceres. That's spelled C-E-R-E-S. Ceres is a nonprofit organization working with the most influential investors and companies to build leadership and drive sustainable solutions through the economy. Ms. Lubber will discuss the history of Ceres, the impact of COVID-19 on sustainable financing and investment, and the future outlook for climate action. Mindy, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Mindy, could you begin by telling us a little bit about the history of Ceres as a nonprofit organization? What has changed from 1989 to now, and what has remained the same?
One interesting thing is Ceres' mission in 1989, when it was founded, is Ceres' mission today in 2021. That's unique. We've all been part of NGOs and building enterprises, and the mission often morphs into one thing or another, and which is not to say we haven't made changes, and a good many of them. But our mission to integrate sustainability into capital markets was what we were about then, and it is indeed what we're about today. Our case is we cannot somehow diminish the global impact of the most important sustainability issues as environmental issues or social issues or something that a small little special group at a company or an investment firm ought to deal with. These issues are global, they're financial, they're human, they're planetary, and they run to the very future of our society. And our job is to make sure that it's not only nonprofits or government, but that we work with the world's largest companies and investors to integrate sustainability.
Believe it or not, just this morning I was asked on a talk that I was giving, what is the business case for sustainability? So I cannot help but ask you now, what is your take? How do you answer that question? What is the business case for sustainability?
So not only is sustainability issues, and I'll break them a little bit down a little bit more, is there a business case, but there's an mandatory business case in our minds. If you take a look at water, we'll go to climate, we'll go to human capital. Every single company I know, there's probably a few exceptions, depend on water, access to water, the ability to run factories, the ability to be consultants to companies who deal with water, the ability to be a Coke or a Pepsi or a General Mills, or the ability to be an apparel company and not have your cotton crop either drown or dried out from the heat, of which we've seen both. Right now, we're not looking at that in a systemic way. In 5 years from now, literally 5 years from now, according to the World Economic Forum, according to the best science, we will have 30% less water than we need as a world community. The impact on women, on human beings, on family, on businesses, on investors, on every part of our society is profound. But the number of companies who can't make what they make, who can't produce what they produce, who can't put out to the marketplace what they need to put out, and who can't then generate the revenues they're committed to generating is extraordinarily high. Climate change even worse. Think about climate change. Trillions of dollars globally over the last year alone of impacts from storms, from droughts, from tsunamis, from migration. Those things are only growing. What we learned from COVID is not only is it a massive, enormous, unthinkable human crisis, which it is. When you have 500,000 people die, there are no words for it. It shakes our humanity, but it also shakes our economy. I live in a well-to-do town. I walk up and down the streets near my home in Brookline. The number of storefronts closed, the number of restaurants done. Our economy is being profoundly impacted by the systemic shock of COVID. The systemic shock of climate change and water risk and other things will be far greater, far greater. And so not looking at those issues, letting them get worse, thinking we could address them when it's too late, when they're hitting us in the face, is sheer incomprehensibility. It's malpractice. If you were a board member of a publicly traded company or a trustee of the largest pension funds and not asking questions around what are the risks from sustainability, I would argue you're in breach of your fiduciary duty. And it goes well beyond the environmental side. It goes to diversity. Companies are being evaluated based on who is on their board and who works for them. And companies that want to ignore the fact that we're a different world now than we were before, and that our boards and staff need to look like the world that we matriculate in, are countries that are not thinking forward, and they're not getting ready for the world as we know it. So I would answer the question, what does sustainability have to do with the economy and business? I'd argue, what is it? How does it not have everything to do with it? Because indeed, that's what the facts show us.
In fact, as one wise person once told me, what is the business case for the alternative? And why do we always ask, what's the business case for sustainability?
I mean, correct. Think about it. When I was talking to the Gap and Levi Strauss a couple of years ago when there was a drought and their cotton crop got decimated, not 100%, they're diversified. But it meant 3% share value to a company. These things are happening every single day. We've just got to be focused on not only understanding they're about to hit us more and more, but acting before they hit us. If we acted on the pandemic well before last February, in terms of planning for it, we wouldn't have lost this tragic 500,000 people.
Yep, quite true. And that's a good segue as well to our next question, given the interesting work that Ceres does with the capital markets. So why did Ceres choose to focus on capital market influencers? Who are these groups in your mind?
Sure. I've spent a lot of time in my near 4 decades working in this space, approaching these problems in different ways. One, as a lawyer, how many companies could you sue who are violating the law? One is a regulator, as the regional administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. What rules do we change to deal with polluters, and how do we get 50 companies to stop? Or how do we sue one company and spend $400 million on one lawsuit that takes 4 years to resolve? And spent years in the capital markets running a small investment firm, and then as an advocate. And I will say the following. When I left the EPA, when I left the Clinton administration, I did think about where is the best place to have an impact. Could have gone to a law firm, back to a straight advocacy group. And what I determined was we cannot win. We cannot take on these challenges and succeed if everything is a fight. If the only way to get a company to do something is to sue them, that'll take 4 years. It'll take $400 million. It'll take 40 lawyers and scientists. We'll never get there. We will never get there. We have got to make the case that these issues are not environmental issues or lefty issues or issues that you deal with on the East Coast and the West Coast, but they're fundamental issues that run to our economy. And that the greatest reach, depth, breadth of capital is in the private sector. So rather than spend all of our time arguing with company after company, how do you make the case in the best way possible that large publicly traded companies or small companies driven by private equity ought to be integrating sustainability? And that was hard to do 15 years ago. It is not hard to do now. The largest companies understand and see that they've got to act on climate, on diversity. Are they all doing it? No. Are we satisfied with their goals? No. But we are not fighting the battle anymore of why it belongs at their board level and in their C-suite. And think about it. The world's largest companies have enormous amounts of money in terms of changing their practices, changing their supply chain, reaching consumers, reaching others through marketing campaigns. The sheer size and the amount of resources. And the same thing with the other half of our work. We work with some of the world's largest investors, 540 global investors with $50 trillion in assets under management. They have the ability to move markets. And so we focus on large market players because their reach, their resources, their ability to change. When we bring companies and investors up to the Capitol, be it a state capitol or the Congress, and they say we need a price on carbon, or we need to put a limit on carbon emissions or methane emissions, it's heard with a different ear than environmental community. So we need all kinds of voices making those cases. And the final thing is we have to move the regulators. Somehow federal financial regulators or state regulators haven't been looking at the impacts of climate risk. Well, the Securities and Exchange Commission's job is to make sure that investors know the risk of every company that is within their reach, all publicly traded companies, and that they're disclosing the material risks of climate change, of race issues, of water issues. And if they're not, they ought to be urged to do that through an enforcement mechanism. So we would argue that the SEC, the Federal Reserve, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission all have a role to play in regulating and addressing the risks from sustainability issues. And I would tell you, just like with companies, 5 years ago, these conversations were tough. Today, they're not so tough. With regulators, they are moving with a vengeance.
So how has the new administration impacted your efforts and your enthusiasm?
Well, it's hard to overstate what a difference it is. And I don't want to have a political discussion or a partisan discussion, because I don't think an issue like climate change should be about R's versus D's. But regrettably, in the last administration, literally they tried to wipe the words climate change off the map. Like no government agencies were literally allowed to talk about it or write about it. I mean, we now have an administration that has set audacious goals for every agency in the administration and every office as it relates to what kind of supplies they buy, what kind of fleets they buy, every single thing. They're looking at every regulation that was rolled back, how much methane emissions should be allowed in the air, and what are fuel efficiency standards, what are realistic versus the ones that were rolled back by the last administration. They're moving. They've put some of the best people into the administration. They're making changes every day. And their leadership is bringing other leadership. When General Motors announced a week into the new administration that by 2035 they will not produce another combustion engine vehicle coming off their assembly lines, that every vehicle will be an electric vehicle, that was because they knew there probably would be regulations. But whatever, we're seeing progress and at the speed of light. Now, that doesn't mean we'll get everything. It doesn't mean we won't have to fight for things. It doesn't mean there won't be strong opposition to many of the things the administration has to do. But we've got a shot at real change. And I hope we take advantage of that. And I hope we could talk to you in 3 years or so about results.
How has COVID-19 actually impacted the enthusiasm and the urgency around sustainability, particularly with investors? I mean, are they asking or doubling down on sustainability, or has it taken a backseat to profits and such?
So about a month into COVID, we called many of our members, investors, companies, and said, what is this going to mean? And I think I could summarize easily two things. One is, for a month or two, all focus was on COVID. So there was definitely a slowdown. That was the most temporary slowdown I've ever seen. The enthusiasm, the goal setting, the mission, the mandate of large companies and investors did not stay slowed down or taking a back seat. They've doubled down, in my judgment. The number of companies who are committing to a net zero or a Paris-aligned future is growing every day. We're now working with investors who are working with us to build portfolios that by 2040 will be net zero. These are enormous changes. 2 years ago, we couldn't get investors to agree to that. Today, we can. It's very different. It's very different when people like Larry Fink from BlackRock are putting out reports every other day about why climate risk has to be evaluated in all their portfolios. He wasn't saying that 5 years ago. It was a stretch. It was a fight. It was a debate. It was a battle. The voices have changed. The leadership has changed. The commitment has changed. I'd say we're seeing a lot of goals being set, and all of that's good. But I don't want to get too overly enthusiastic. We still have a long way to go. We have to make sure that the goals being set are real. We have to make sure that long-term goals that companies and investors are setting have short-term and mid-term goals to go with it. If we wait to meet goals for 2040 or 2050 and start the process of doing things in 2035, we fail. Unquestionably, we fail. So we need short, medium, and long-term goals. We need transparency and accountability. And that's the job that we all have to do.
What Ceres initiative are you most excited about at this point?
Well, we've got one initiative about transforming financial markets. So what does that mean? It means that we're working in 4 ways. One is we're trying to work with banks to set goals around climate risk and what that means, what they disclose, number one, and will they set goals for 2040. And not only goals for their scope 1 or scope 2, their offices, their immediate work, but for their clients. They don't get credit for being a leader if they're financing coal-fired power plants or oil and gas plants. They have got to move their clients along with their own practices. We're also working to change asset managers, the people who manage all of our money. So they are analyzing climate risk in every portfolio decision. Don't bring on a new company until you really understand. Is it an insurance company? Are they going to pay out an extra $500 billion every year because of climate change? It's got to be factored in, and we believe when it's factored in, it will change behaviors. We're also working with the largest asset owners, big pension funds and other large owners of assets, in using their power and clout to change how they invest their money, whether it's a clean energy future or oil and gas, and what they expect from the portfolio companies. And then finally, we're trying to change the federal financial regulatory system. The SEC 10 years ago talked about mandating the disclosure of climate risk, and they didn't enforce against it. I believe in the next 2 years, we're going to see mandatory climate risk disclosure at the SEC level. I think the new commissioner and some of the present commissioners are ready to take that on. The Federal Reserve Bank, last year they weren't talking about climate risk. Now they are talking about climate risk. So what kind of regulatory changes do they need to make in their oversight of banks in assuring that we have a stable economy? And I think they're ready to start looking at that. I mean, Janet Yellen, the new Secretary of the Treasury, we've never heard a Secretary of the Treasury talking about climate risk. She's written a book on it. And she is going to put in place a senior level staff person to look at every federal regulatory agency to see how they're addressing the very real, the very financial, material impacts of climate risk and how it impacts our economy. So, it's a big world of federal or capital markets. We got to take it on piece by piece. We also, as you know, work with the world's largest companies. But we're focused like a laser on asset owners, asset managers, banks, insurance companies, and all of those that regulate them.
So Mindy, we're coming to the close of our time, and I'm going to ask you for 2 calls to action. So what message would you like to communicate to the corporate leaders who are going to be listening to this show?
Looking at sustainability has morphed from a special initiative in many companies to a core part of the strategy. So for any company, their boards of directors need to be involved in setting goals around sustainability, not every sustainability issue, but the ones that are most material to the company. And every part of the firm, every part, needs to have sustainability goals consistent with the firm's goals. So it's not just one department. This is the responsibility. If it is a material risk to the company, it needs to be integrated into strategic planning, into the CFO's office, into discussions, into staff issues, and all drive that all the way through to your supply chain. So as we say, from the boardroom to the supply chain, the only way we're going to help small companies move is with the help of those who employ those small companies to be their suppliers. So the bottom line is, if you're a large publicly traded company or even a large enterprise, integrating sustainability from the boardroom to the supply chain right into strategic planning is absolutely crucial. My second point is, it is not only your investors, if you're a company looking at the pressure points, your employees and future employees, and every company is recruiting the best and the brightest and competing with each other. Every employee, I shouldn't say every, but the data shows employees want to work for a mission-driven company. It doesn't mean it's not a company that's driving profits as well, but they need a broader mission along with short-term earnings. That's what the young people are looking for, and that's where they get excited to work for. And consumers are starting to ask all the questions. Are the companies I'm buying at companies that treat their workers fairly, treat the planet fairly? They're asking those questions, and we'll see more of that every day. So all forces are conspiring, and I would say in a good way, to make sure that we're integrating sustainability into our capital markets. because all of these issues are very real as a market capital issue, as well, of course, as a planetary and human issues.
And then finally, what about the other listeners who are going to listen to this wonderful podcast? What message do you want to convey to them?
Integrate this. Think broadly about your role as citizens, which is no different than your role as in democracy as voters. Do learn about where you want to shop, what kind of products you want to buy, how you lead your life. Do you need 4 cars, or might 2 cars do it? Can you buy an electric car as the next car? Do you need 3 flat screen TVs? I mean, nobody's asking people to go live in a hut. None of us want to do that. But in the United States in particular, we certainly take liberties with resources. We have more than we know what to do with, and we all expect to keep having more. Think about what you eat. We know that meat has a far greater impact on the climate than not eating meat, which also happens to be a healthier way to live your life. So as citizens, there is much we can do. Where we buy, what we eat, what we teach our children. I'm a small investor. I'm not one of these large investors we work with. But when I get those little shareholder forms that come in the mail or now come online, I now vote my proxies. I look to make sure, is there a shareholder resolution on climate change or on diversity? And I'm going to do my duty as a citizen and as a small investor to vote those proxies, even though most of us throw those things away. It's time for us to have more of an impact. And finally, vote. Vote your conscience. Vote for the people who share the values you believe in. You can make a difference, each and every one of you.
Mindy Lubber, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for your time.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
And this is your host, CB Bhattacharya, saying goodbye, and we'll see you next time on another edition of Sustaining Sustainability.
And before I sign off, I do want to say that this podcast is made possible by the help of my colleagues, Leslie Marshall, who's the Associate Director of the Center for Sustainable Business, and Alyssa Martinec, who is the Sustainability Coordinator of the Center for Sustainable Business. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya. Bye-bye.